The radio signal came from somewhere in Tokyo. Japanese military counterintelligence, the Kempeitai, had been intercepting encrypted transmissions for months. Someone in their capital city was sending military secrets to Moscow. Someone with access to classified information about Japanese military plans, about German embassy discussions, about the highest levels of government deliberations. The Kempeitai knew this Soviet agent existed. They could track his radio broadcasts. They knew he was incredibly well placed, but they had no idea who he was. For 2 years, Japanese counterintelligence would hunt this phantom agent. They would arrest members of his network, conduct interrogations, follow leads through Tokyo's labyrinth of contacts and informants. When they finally identified him in October 1941, the revelation would shock Japan's military establishment and humiliate German intelligence. The Soviet spy they had been hunting, the man with access to Germany's most sensitive secrets in Tokyo, was Richard Sorge, a respected German journalist, a member of the Nazi Party, and the trusted personal friend of the German ambassador to Japan. This is the story of how a German who fought for the Kaiser in the First World War became the Soviet Union's most dangerous spy, how his intelligence saved Moscow from capture, and how Japanese counterintelligence spent 2 years hunting a man hiding in plain sight. Part 1. The making of a double agent. Richard Sorge was born on October 4th, 1895, in Baku, then part of the Russian Empire, now Azerbaijan. His father was a German petroleum engineer working in the Baku oil fields. His mother was Russian. This dual heritage, German and Russian, would define Sorge's life in ways no one could have predicted when he was born into a comfortable, middle-class family in that Caspian Sea city. The Sorge family moved to Germany when Richard was 3 years old, settling in Berlin. He grew up German in every meaningful sense, speaking German as his first language, attending German schools, absorbing German culture and identity. By the time war came in 1914, 19-year-old Richard Sorge considered himself completely German. He volunteered for the German army without hesitation. The Western Front transformed him. Sorge served in the trenches, experiencing the industrial slaughter that defined the First World War. He was wounded 3 times, once seriously when shrapnel tore through his legs. He received the Iron Cross for bravery, but more significantly, the war radicalized his politics. In the trenches, Sorge met socialist and communist soldiers who questioned why working-class men were dying for imperial ambitions. These conversations planted seeds that would fundamentally alter his ideology. By 1918, as Germany collapsed into defeat and revolution, Sorge had become a committed communist. He joined the Communist Party of Germany in 1919. While still recovering from his war wounds, he threw himself into communist activism with the same intensity he had shown as a soldier. He earned a doctorate in political science, writing his dissertation on Marxist economics. He worked as a teacher and organizer. By the mid-1920s, Sorge's commitment to communism had come to the attention of Soviet intelligence. In 1924, Sorge was recruited by the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. He traveled to Moscow for training. Soviet intelligence recognized what they had in Sorge, a genuine German fluent in German and Russian, highly educated, personally brave, ideologically committed, and capable of moving through German society without suspicion. He was perfect for deep cover operations. Sorge's first major assignment came in 1929, when he was sent to China. His cover was journalist, and it wasn't entirely a cover. Sorge actually wrote articles for German newspapers, building a genuine reputation as a knowledgeable correspondent covering Asian affairs. In Shanghai, he built a spy network, gathered intelligence on Chinese politics and Japanese military activities in China, and refined his tradecraft. He learned to live a double life, respected journalist by day, Soviet intelligence officer by night. By 1933, Sorge had proven himself valuable enough for a much more important assignment. Soviet intelligence wanted an agent in Tokyo. Japan was becoming increasingly militaristic and expansionist. Understanding Japanese strategic intentions was critical for Moscow, especially given Japan's proximity to Soviet territories in the Far East. Sorge was chosen for this mission. His cover would be the same, respected German journalist. But this time, he would add a layer that made him nearly untouchable. He would join the Nazi Party. Part 2. The perfect cover Richard Sorge arrived in Tokyo in September 1933 with impeccable credentials. He carried press accreditation from prestigious German newspapers, including the Frankfurter Zeitung. He had published articles about Asian politics. He was educated, sophisticated, and spoke multiple languages fluently. To the German expatriate community in Tokyo and to Japanese authorities who vetted foreign journalists, Sorge appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a German journalist covering Japanese affairs. But Sorge had one additional credential that made him especially valuable and especially immune to suspicion. In Germany, before leaving for Tokyo, he had joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. He carried a Nazi Party membership card. This wasn't unusual for a German journalist in 1933. The Nazis had just come to power. Many Germans joined the party for career reasons, to demonstrate loyalty to the new regime, to maintain professional opportunities. Sorge's membership appeared completely innocent, a journalist ensuring he could continue working for German publications. In reality, this Nazi Party membership was perhaps the most brilliant element of Sorge's cover. It made him trustworthy to German officials in Tokyo. It gave him access to German embassy social functions. It allowed him to move in circles where sensitive information was discussed, and it made the idea that he could be a Soviet spy seem absolutely impossible. Sorge quickly established himself in Tokyo. He rented a house in a respectable neighborhood. He wrote articles about Japanese politics and society that were published in German newspapers. Genuine journalism that maintained his cover and actually paid money. He learned Japanese, adding it to his collection of languages, and he began the careful work of building a spy network. His most important recruit was Ozaki Hotsumi, a Japanese journalist and political analyst who had communist sympathies. Ozaki was extraordinarily well connected. He served as an advisor to the Japanese government on Chinese affairs and had access to high-level policy discussions. Through Ozaki, Sorge gained insight into Japanese government decision-making that would prove invaluable. Sorge also recruited Hanako Ishii, a Japanese woman who became his lover and assistant. She helped with translations, provided cover for meetings, and offered insights into Japanese society. Another key member was Max Clausen, a German communist who served as Sorge's radio operator, transmitting intelligence to Moscow using a powerful radio hidden in his home. But Sorge's masterstroke was befriending Lieutenant Colonel Eugen Ott, the German military attaché in Tokyo. Ott and Sorge became close friends. They drank together, discussed politics and military strategy, attended social functions together. When Ott was promoted to German ambassador to Japan in 1938, Sorge's access reached its peak. He was now the close personal friend of Germany's ambassador, attending embassy parties, reading diplomatic cables, sitting in on sensitive conversations. The German embassy staff trusted Sorge completely. Why wouldn't they? He was German, he was educated and sophisticated. He was a Nazi Party member. He was the ambassador's friend. The idea that this man who attended embassy Christmas parties and celebrated German military victories with embassy personnel was actually a Soviet spy seemed impossible. And so Richard Sorge sat at the center of a web of information. Through Ozaki, he learned Japanese government secrets. Through the German embassy, he learned German diplomatic and military intelligence. Through his own journalistic contacts, he gathered information from across Tokyo, and through Max Clausen's radio, he sent it all to Moscow. Part 3. The Warnings That Changed History. By 1941, Richard Sorge had been operating in Tokyo for 8 years. He had built his cover so thoroughly that he was beyond suspicion. And he was about to provide intelligence that would change the course of the Second World War. In May 1941, Sorge began picking up disturbing information through his German embassy contacts. Germany was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. Ambassador Ott discussed it with Sorge during their conversations, not as secret intelligence, but as something Ott assumed was obvious to any informed observer watching German troop movements. Sorge gathered every detail he could: the approximate date of the attack, the number of divisions being positioned, the strategic objectives. On May 15, 1941, Sorge transmitted to Moscow: Germany would attack the Soviet Union. He provided details about German preparations. Over the following weeks, as his information solidified, Sorge sent additional messages. On June 1st, he transmitted that the attack would come in the second half of June. On June 21st, one day before the invasion, he sent his final warning. The attack would begin on June 22nd, 1941. The warning was ignored. Joseph Stalin received Sorge's intelligence. He also received similar warnings from other sources. Stalin dismissed them all as provocations, as attempts by Britain to draw the Soviet Union into war with Germany. On June 22nd, 1941, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Operation Barbarossa began. German forces crashed across the Soviet border exactly as Sorge had warned. The Soviet Union was catastrophically unprepared precisely because Stalin had ignored accurate intelligence. But Sorge's most important intelligence was yet to come. By autumn 1941, the German army was driving toward Moscow. The Soviet capital appeared doomed. But Moscow's fate depended on a critical question. Would Japan attack the Soviet Union from the east? If Japan opened the second front, the Soviet Union would have to fight Germany and Japan simultaneously. This would likely be fatal. Soviet forces in the Far East would be needed to defend against Japan, making them unavailable for the defense of Moscow. Stalin needed to know, what would Japan do? Through Ozaki Hotsumi, who attended Japanese government planning sessions, Sorge learned the answer. Japan had made a strategic decision. They would not attack the Soviet Union. Instead, Japan would move south against American, British, and Dutch territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Japan wanted oil, rubber, and other resources. These were in the south, not in the frozen forests of Siberia. In October 1941, Sorge transmitted this intelligence to Moscow. Japan will not attack the Soviet Union. Stalin could safely move Soviet forces from the Far East to defend Moscow. This time, Stalin believed intelligence. He ordered massive transfers of troops from Siberia to the Moscow front. Approximately 30 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and artillery moved from the Far East to Moscow. These fresh, well-equipped Siberian troops arrived in November and December 1941 as German forces reached Moscow's outskirts. The Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941, which pushed German forces back from Moscow and saved the capital, was made possible by these Siberian reinforcements. Richard Sorge's intelligence saved Moscow. If Stalin had not known that Japan would not attack, those Siberian divisions could not have been moved. Without those divisions, Moscow likely falls. Part 4. The hunt closes in. While Sorge was providing intelligence that saved Moscow, Japanese counterintelligence was closing in. The Kempeitai had been aware, since at least 1939, that a sophisticated Soviet spy ring operated in Tokyo. They could detect radio transmissions. Max Clausen's powerful radio was hard to hide from radio direction finding equipment. But finding the source of transmissions in a city as large as Tokyo was extraordinarily difficult. The Kempeitai began arresting suspected communists and Soviet sympathizers. Through interrogations, often involving torture, they slowly worked their way towards Sorge's network. In June 1941, they arrested Hotsumi Miyagi, an artist who was a minor member of Sorge's ring. Miyagi endured interrogation but eventually gave the Kempeitai a name, Ozaki Hotsumi. The name shocked the Kempeitai investigators. Ozaki was not some marginal communist. He was a respected journalist, a government advisor on Chinese affairs, a man who moved in the highest circles of Japanese politics. Could he really be part of a Soviet spy network? The Kempeitai investigated carefully. By September 1941, they had enough evidence. On October 4th, 1941, they arrested Ozaki. Under interrogation, Ozaki eventually broke. He revealed the existence of Richard Sorge's network. He named Sorge as the leader. The Kempeitai officers could barely believe what they were hearing. Sorge? The German journalist? The Nazi Party member? The friend of Ambassador Ott? This seemed impossible. The Kempeitai spent 2 weeks investigating Sorge before making their move. They observed him. They verified information from Ozaki's confession. They checked Sorge's background, his activities, his contacts. Everything confirmed what Ozaki had told them. The impossible was true. On October 18th, 1941, Japanese police arrested Richard Sorge at his home in Tokyo. They searched his house and found incriminating materials, codes, documents, information that confirmed he was a Soviet agent. Simultaneously, they arrested Max Clausen and other members of the ring. The arrest sent shockwaves through Tokyo's German community. Ambassador Ott was devastated. His closest friend, the man he had trusted completely, was a Soviet spy. The man who had attended his family dinners, who had celebrated German victories with him, who had access to embassy documents, a Soviet agent. Ott's career was effectively over. The humiliation was unbearable. The Kempeitai officers who had hunted the Soviet spy ring for 2 years felt vindicated but also astonished. They had expected to find a Japanese communist or perhaps a Soviet émigré. Instead, they had uncovered a German Nazi Party member operating at the heart of both Japanese and German circles in Tokyo. The audacity of it was breathtaking. German authorities in Berlin were informed. The Gestapo investigated and confirmed that Sorge's Nazi Party membership was genuine. He had actually joined the party, carried a real membership card. The German intelligence services conducted an internal investigation to determine if other German agents abroad might also be Soviet spies. The scandal reached the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Part 5. The final years. Richard Sorge spent 3 years in Japanese custody before his execution. The Japanese interrogated him extensively. Unlike many intelligence officers who refused to cooperate, Sorge eventually confessed to his activities. He described his recruitment by Soviet intelligence, his years in China, his Tokyo operations, the intelligence he had gathered and transmitted. He believed, perhaps naively, that cooperation might save his life, or at least secure better treatment. The Japanese offered to exchange Sorge and other captured Soviet agents for Japanese prisoners held by the Soviet Union. But in one of the cruelest ironies of Sorge's story, the Soviet Union refused. Moscow publicly denied that Sorge was a Soviet agent. Stalin would not acknowledge him. The man who had provided intelligence that saved Moscow was disowned by the regime he had served. Why did Stalin abandon Sorge? Perhaps acknowledging Sorge would compromise other agents. Perhaps Stalin, paranoid as always, suspected Sorge might be a double agent. Perhaps Stalin simply didn't care about one agent's fate when larger strategic considerations were at stake. Whatever the reason, Sorge was left alone in a Japanese prison with no hope of rescue or exchange. On November 7th, 1944, Richard Sorge and Ozaki Hotsumi were executed by hanging in Tokyo. Sorge's last words were reportedly Sovietsky Soyuz, Soviet Union, and Krasnaya Armia, Red Army. He died loyal to the cause he had served, even though that cause had abandoned him. The Japanese kept the execution secret. News of Sorge's death did not reach the West until after Japan's surrender in August 1945. Even then, the full story of his activities remained classified for years. Legacy. For 20 years after his death, Richard Sorge remained officially unacknowledged by the Soviet Union. Then, in 1964, the Soviet government finally admitted that Sorge had been their agent. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously, the highest honor the Soviet Union could bestow. Streets in Soviet cities were named after him. Postage stamps bore his image. He became a celebrated figure in Soviet history, held up as the model of the dedicated intelligence officer. The full extent of Sorge's intelligence contributions became clear only after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives were partially opened. Historians could finally assess his impact. The consensus among serious historians is that Sorge was one of the most important intelligence agents of the Second World War. His information about Japanese intentions in October 1941 directly enabled the Soviet counteroffensive that saved Moscow. Without Sorge's intelligence, Stalin would not have dared move the Siberian divisions, and Moscow's defense would have lacked the forces necessary to push back the German army. The story of Richard Sorge raises uncomfortable questions about loyalty, ideology, and betrayal. By the standards of German law and German patriotism, Sorge was a traitor who betrayed his country to its enemies. By the standards of Soviet and communist ideology, he was a hero who placed loyalty to the international working class above narrow nationalism. These contradictory assessments cannot be reconciled. Sorge remains a figure who evokes admiration and condemnation depending on one's perspective. What cannot be disputed is his operational success. For 8 years, Sorge operated in Tokyo under the deepest cover, fooling both Japanese and German counterintelligence. He built networks that penetrated both governments. He transmitted intelligence that altered the course of history, and he did all of this while living a double life that required extraordinary discipline and nerve. The Kempeitai officers who finally caught him acknowledged this. In post-war interviews, Japanese intelligence officers admitted that Sorge had been the most sophisticated Soviet agent they ever encountered. His cover was so perfect that even after his arrest, some German embassy personnel refused to believe he had been a spy. The cognitive dissonance was too great. How could a Nazi party member be a Soviet agent? Richard Sorge died believing the Soviet cause would triumph. He died abandoned by the regime he served, betrayed by Stalin's refusal to acknowledge him. But he also died knowing he had achieved something remarkable. He had warned Stalin of Germany's invasion, even though that warning was ignored. And he had provided the intelligence that saved Moscow, contributing directly to the Soviet Union's eventual victory. One man living a lie in Tokyo changed the war. That is Richard Sorge's legacy.